All right, for more now on all the demonstrations that we've seen on college campuses, I'm joined now by Shamil Idriss, the CEO for Search for Common Ground, a global peace-building organization. Shamil, great to see you. So I understand that you see these demonstrations, these protests, as an important display of what today's youth leadership looks like. What do you mean by that?
Well, Fred, thanks for having me on. I think one of the things that we've seen in this country and globally is that youth movements, especially the ones that attract a huge diversity across race, religion, ethnicity, like this one has, make the world a better place eventually. And we've seen, I think, in this country, one of the most consistent patterns over the last, 60 years has been that those movements manifest through college campus protests that at the time of the protest is oftentimes opposed, ridiculed, kind of set aside, or violently even kind of suppressed. But then years later is looked back upon with a lot of credit and recognition that they were onto something. This happened with the Civil Rights Movement and the Freedom Riders. This happened with the Vietnam War movement. This happened with the anti-apartheid movement. That doesn't address the charges of anti-Semitism vis-a-vis these protests, but I think that is one of the most consistent patterns. And that's why where we work everywhere in the world, we not only work with the top leaders, heads of state, et cetera, but also always with youth activists.
So demonstrators today are vowing, to keep these protests up. What challenges do you see for students with opposing views to coexist on campus?
Well, there should be certain things that kind of go without saying or beyond the bounds, violence and threats of violence. And I think, some of the things that we've seen publicly, like when the congressional testimony of university leaders, when even the specific question was asked, if somebody explicitly threatens genocide against the Jews, is that bullying and harassment? And there wasn't just a clear and obvious yes. That really has given people pause and concern that universities aren't handling this well. I think to answer your question, one of the difficult things with this conflict, with all conflicts, but we definitely see it here, is that the very same words and slogans mean really very different things to different people. What does the word Zionist mean? What does the word Intifada mean? What does from the river to the sea mean? I'm seeing very confident statements by critics across the board of what those things mean when other people say them. But I know, for example, self-described Zionists who are among some of the most kind of persistent and courageous defenders of Palestinian rights, but also think that Israel has a right to exist and needs to be safe. I know people who talk longingly about the first Intifada, which was a nonviolent movement that mobilized young people and women and men in equal measure, and look at that in that way and look differently on the second Intifada. So I think when we hear these things, the only way to really get to the bottom of them is through dialogue. When I hear somebody describe themselves or use one of those terms, my first instinct, I don't think, should be to project onto them my biases of what they mean, but to ask them what they mean. Mm-hmm. And I think we really have to reinitiate that kind of dialogue and questioning process among young people.
Right, because perhaps among a lot of young people, some don't really know I guess the history of everything that they're saying, or from what the derivatives are, and they're learning as they go. So then, given these things are happening on college campuses, places of learning, how do you see campuses trying to foster harmony while allowing various voices of dissent to be heard? What should they do differently, perhaps, or how does everyone learn from what has been transpiring?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there are three very clear things that campuses can do. Before I say them, I just say I think we should give some of these young people more credit than we are. I don't think the older generation, my generation and up, certainly the political leadership in our country, I don't know that we've set the best example for the current up-and-coming generation of how to deal with difference. In fact, I know we haven't. And so when I see the Jewish student at Yale talking about the discussions that were had about how certain slogans land differently and are hurtful, and those slogans then weren't used on the Yale campus, I think there's a lot more of that kind of dialogue and cooperation going on. But there are three things campuses can do and should do. I think the first is to build relationships of trust across the dividing lines on your campus. There's a saying in the humanitarian sector that you don't exchange business cards in the middle of a hurricane. So doing this in the middle of the most heated conflict is hard. But the first time that the Hillel, the student association leader, and the Muslim student association leader on your campus meet shouldn't be on opposite lines of a picket line or a demonstration. And campuses that are organizing ad hoc committees about anything, the meal plan on the campus, how to make the campus safer, anything that can involve students, especially across some of those, divided communities, they should be brought in so that they can collaborate on common issues that have nothing to do perhaps with the conflict, but build their trust. I think the second thing campuses could do is teach and train in dialogue. And frankly, not just the students, but the faculty and the administrators as well. My own organization invested in some surge capacity just to meet the demand that we're getting from campuses for training and how do you facilitate dialogue across difference. And I think that's a really powerful thing that we can do rather than just put more rules down on young people, actually invest in their capacity and frankly the faculty's capacity to navigate difference as well. And I think the third thing is we have to acknowledge that the way that we've been teaching, I think, about identity and oppression and these issues has been, necessary in some ways, but oftentimes overly simplistic. I just had an example, very close to my family where a student was asked to write a paper about oppression and wanted to write about his grandparents and then was told that because they were white European Jews, they didn't count as oppressed, despite the fact that they survived the Holocaust. And I think that the lens of oppression that's very reductive, that sees everything through a US lens of race, isn't really very helpful in understanding the complexity of what's going on in the world. But those are three things that can be done. Build those relationships across difference, train your students and your faculty in dialogue skills, and look again at how we're teaching about identity and oppression so we can better capture the complexity of what's happening in the world.
All right, advice, we'll see how or when or where it might be applied. Shamil Idriss, thank you so much.
Thank you.